Bapak Ibu hadirin yang kami hormati, berikut kami bacakan tata tertib untuk kegiatan virtual hari ini. 1. Pastikan perangkat elektronik Anda terisi dengan baik. 2. Gunakan earphone untuk kualitas suara yang lebih baik. 3. Gunakan data pilih virtual background yang telah disediakan. 4. Mohon gunakan kolom chat dengan bijak dan baik. 5. Pastikan jaringan internet Anda stabil. 6. Selama acara berlangsung, peserta dimohon menghidupkan fitur kamera dan mematikan suara. Terima kasih. Pembacaan protokol kesehatan kiat jaga kesehatan saat berkegiatan. 1. Jaga jarak minimal 1,5 meter. 2. Selalu pakai masker. 3. Rajin cuci tangan. 4. Siap selalu dengan hand sanitizer. 5. Jaga kebugaran tubuh dan konsumsi vitamin secara teratur. 6. Hindari berbagi pemakaian benda pribadi. 7. Saling mengingatkan pentingnya protokol kesehatan. Ladies and gentlemen, the BMEB lecture will begin shortly. Please kindly turn on the camera and turn off the microphone. Thank you. The Head of Research Center Bank Indonesia Institute, Dr. Iman Gunadi. Distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, and good morning to all of you. On behalf of the committee, with the warmest regards, we have the pleasure of welcoming you to BMEB Lecture on the 15th Bulletin of Monetary Economics and Banking International Conference and Call for Papers 2021. To start off the event, we would like to invite Head of Research Center Bank Indonesia Institute, Dr. Iman Gunadi, to deliver the welcoming remarks.
Distinguished guest speakers, Professor Hermanto Siregar and Dr. Arif Ayandi, honorable guests from government institution, distinguished guests from partner institution, the academia, research institution, and participant of the conference, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good morning and thank you very much to all of you for joining this morning lecture. First of all, I wish to express my most sincere gratitude and appreciation to Professor Hermanto Siregar, who always has time to share his knowledge and wisdom to us. Here, I would like also to mention and pay my sincere thanks to my very good friend, Dr. Arif Ayandi, who will share his thought to enrich our perspective to cope with the COVID-19 pandemic. It is very clear in our mind when the coronavirus fears many people to do their daily activities and restrict us to travel. For the most of us, this condition has never been before. Some people, unfortunately, were ignorant, and that's why this pandemic is going to be prolonged, with no one knows when this will be over. Since last year, pandemic COVID-19 has put Indonesian economy under considerable pressure. Indonesian economic growth experienced in deep contraction in 2020 at minus 2.07% year-on-year. This is the first time since financial monetary crisis in 1998. Consumer growth, which is the main driving force of the economy, is the most affected sector by the COVID-19 pandemic. As a result, Indonesia's poverty rate has increased significantly. To avoid further deterioration of Indonesian economy, Bank Indonesia, along with the government and other regulators, have taken several steps and policies, such as decreasing BI 7-day reverse repo rate as a benchmark rate by 125 basis point in 2020, reducing the statutory reserve and conducting triple intervention. These measures are also intended to maintain banking liquidity and market confidence, as well as to accelerate economic recovery. Although it has brought some undesirable impact, COVID-19 pandemic has also brought changes in the behavior of economic agents, especially through increasing digital transaction. The household sector is doing many digital activities to meet the needs of their households, while the corporate sector is trying to respond to this phenomenon by changing its business process transformation to keep up with the market changes. The number of marketers who conduct digital transactions through e-commerce has also saw a rapid increase during the pandemic. Accordingly, Bank Indonesia has taken an active role in supporting digital transformation in the national economy. A couple of weeks ago, for example, Bank Indonesia issued a series of policy to support the acceleration of digitalization process in the domestic economy and financial market. These are including implementation of the Quick Response Code Indonesian Standard or QRIS or CRIS to make financial transactions quickly and safely, standardization of the application and programming interface or API to accelerate payment collaborating among banks and also between banks and non-banks. In addition, Bank Indonesia issued some revision to several payment system regulation to accelerate the digitization process in the domestic financial system. Digital transformation require more innovative policies to develop the digital market, considering that Indonesia is a potential market for e-commerce. Indonesia population of working age reaches around 200 million, making e-commerce a promising market in the future. E-commerce can also encourage of small and medium-sized business sector, which play an important role in the economy and Indonesian economy to be more developed. Policy in digital transformation sector aim to facilitate transaction and protect the interests of buyers so that transaction can run smoothly. In this context, the role of Bank Indonesia is to anticipate the development of digital transaction and economic recovery due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Digital market development requires a greater regulatory role at a time when the market is still in its early stages of the development. It is necessary to have good policy in order to create a code of conduct that is safe and acceptable by the market. The role of Bank Indonesia in this area is in line with the objective of Bank Indonesia in accelerating the recovery of economy. However, support from other parties is a must because domestic economic recovery does not only depend on the role of regulators, but also need an involvement of all economic agents. A synergy and collaboration between regulators and market players should also be enhanced further so that we could take advantages of the development of the digital market as a momentum to revive an economy that is depressed by COVID-19 pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, what I have just talked is only a little bit description of the essence of digital transformation in the pandemic era. I'm sure that our speaker today will provide us with more deeply insight on the importance of digital transformation in order to accelerate the economic recovery during and after COVID-19 pandemic. Hopefully, this event will be beneficial for all of us through the lecture given by the distinguished speakers and a fruitful discussion afterward. I will stop here and thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Dr. Iman Gunadi, for the welcoming remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, now we would like to invite you all to join virtual group photo. Group photo will be taken 2 times. Please turn on your camera and put your best smile. Ladies and gentlemen, please turn on your camera. On our count, the photo will be taken in 1, 2, 3. Once more. In 1, 2, 3. Thank you. Now we shall begin our main agenda today, lecture session. To lead this lecture is Dr. Ridwan. Before we invite Dr. Ridwan, we would like to introduce you to him. Dr. Ridwan is a principal economist and deputy director at Bank Indonesia Institute. He received PhD degree in 2011 in economics and econometrics from Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam and Timbergen Institute, Netherlands. Given his keen interest in research, Dr. Ridwan also engaged actively in academic teaching and supervising postgraduate level, mainly at University of Indonesia and Trisakti University. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our moderator, Dr. Ridwan.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Banya. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A wonderful good morning to all of you, esteemed speakers and participants. The Bulletin of Monetary Economics and Banking lecture session. Today, Friday, the 3rd September on this virtual meeting. I hope all of you always in a good shape, healthy and happy. Amin. In this session, please allow me to be your moderator for this 2-hour session ahead. To our distinguished speakers, especially Professor Hermanto and Dr. Arif Ayandi, thank you very much for your presence today. Before we start our lecture, please allow me to announce the housekeeping rules. For each speaker, you will have around 30 minutes for presentation. To all participants, you can use the chat box for question, and please kindly to mute your Zoom during the session. Let me give some introduction before we continue. This 2020 shall be remembered as the year of the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, with enormous impacts not only from social and economic aspect, but more significantly, its impact to human life conditions. Apart from the adverse impact of this pandemic, we should maintain a good mindset and keep positive thinking, particularly as it brings a rising digitalization, even with a faster speed, as it may be the only safest way to keep interactive or communication one into another. Surprisingly, the world is flat now. It's contrast to like a fragment's book, like we are here now, gathering in one place from different places around the world. The recent G20 symposium always emphasized that in light of this pandemic, economic recovery can be achieved through the digital revolution. Certainly, we need to deal with this vaccination or immunization at first place. Generally speaking, this underlines the role and potential of digital technologies in contributing to inclusive and sustainable development. How digital technology can spur post-pandemic recovery in the developing countries, notably in Asia-Pacific regions. Before we start our session, please allow me to introduce our distinguished speakers. Professor Hermanto from Perbanas Institute. Further details as shown in the screen. The second speaker, Dr. Arif Ayandi, is principal economist at ADB Manila. Next, I would like to welcome Professor Hermanto. Good morning, Professor Hermanto.
Good morning, Pak Ridwan.
How are you? Hopefully you're doing
Alhamdulillah,
fine.
I'm good, yes.
Okay, thank you. I would like to give you time allocation for this presentation. Time allocation is around 30 minutes. The screen is yours, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bapak Dr. Ridwan. First of all, I would like to thank Bank Indonesia Institute for inviting me to give a lecture in this very important occasion. My presentation entitled Digital Transformation and Economic Development. The outline is as follows. Next, please. First, I would like to give a definition about digital transformation, and then its relation with economic value creation, and then I will explain about adverse effects of digital transformation, and lastly, we'll discuss about how to direct digital transformation in order to support inclusive and sustainable development. Next, please. So, digital transformation is actually the integration of digital technology into all areas of a business, fundamentally changing how it operates and delivers value to customers. So it is also cultural change that requires organization to continually challenge the status quo and get comfortable with failure. So we might say that digital transformation develops the conventional economy to become digital economy. What is this? What about digital economy? Digital economy refers to consumers, producers, and governments operate through internet, fixed and mobile broadband infrastructure, cloud computing, digital platforms, etc. So it could be defined as the share of total economic output derived from a number of broad digital inputs, which include digital skills, digital equipment, including hardware, software, and communications equipment, and intermediate digital goods and services utilized in the production process. And digital economy may simply be defined as part of economic output delivered solely or primarily from digital technologies with a business model based on digital goods or services. Next, please. So digital economy currently is estimated from one study about 15% of the global GDP. The evolving digital economy closely associated with several frontier technologies, so digital technologies, and also fueled by the data. Among the frontier technologies, blockchain, data analytics, AI, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, IoT, automation and robotics, as well as cloud computing. Unfortunately, digital economy is highly concentrated mainly in two countries, the US and China. Currently, US and China accounts for around 90% of the market capitalization value all over the world among the 70 largest digital platforms. Although digital economy is growing and quite significant by now, there are still huge digital divides by now because half of the world remains offline even until today. And in LDCs, only 1 out of 5 people are online. And there is a significant gender gap in terms of internet connection, especially in the developing country. Next. So what is the relationship between digital transformation, economic value creation? Well, traditionally, economic value is associated with production of goods and services. There is productive transformation of raw materials into goods and services, creating wealth, which potentially be distributed across society with major actors being producers, consumers, and government as authority to make a distribution or redistribution. And then throughout the digital transformation, two forces increasingly driving the economic value creation, namely platformization and monetization of digital data. Digital platforms are central actors, and digital data have become key resources in economic processes leading to value creation. So platformization could be categorized into two groups, which are transaction platform, and another one is innovation platform. Through this digital transformation, we could see that the linear production process from raw material, intermediate input to final product, and then delivered to consumers, which is linear. It then transformed by the DT using the data, the digital data collection, data processing, data analysis, data monetization, all are called big data. Next. Channels for economic value creation includes platformization, as mentioned before, and then e-commerce, as well as digitalization of value chain. E-commerce platforms bring together broad range of buyers and sellers and provide opportunities for offering a greater variety of goods and services. Their activities can provide a base for firms to dynamically improve and add value to their products and services. And the third channel is the digitalization of value chain, which occurs through modularization as well as servitization. What is it, modularization? It is activity of dividing a product or system into modules that are interchangeably, which can increase the customer value by configuring the right product and also by the speed of development by innovating in one module in the system rather than whole product. And then servitization refers to firms' transition from product-centric business logic focusing on selling products to a more service-oriented business logic focusing on facilitating customer value creation through provision of advanced services and solutions that better fulfill customer specific needs. With all this digital transformation, structural transformation, which traditionally is under industrialization, it become developed to structural transformation from industrialization to digitalization transformation, digital transformation. So for the structural transformation, the traditional one is the industrialization. As you can see, it is the red boxes in the screen. Started from agriculture, natural resources, or primary product, industry, manufacturing, secondary product, and then the services, tertiary products. By digital transformations, it is enriched, including the green boxes, digital agriculture, natural resources, digitized industry, manufacturing, and digitized services. So added value are included in the process or generated in the process significantly. Next. There is a study assesses both direct effects of digitalization, which is the form of productivity increases, as well as indirect effects related to the spillovers, the positive spillovers as well as negative spillovers. They occur through three channels. The internal channels, this is learning by doing. That is how companies amplify their initial gains as they learn more about how to leverage technology. And then horizontal channels are competition effects with innovations by one company being emulated by others, leading to productivity gains across the sector. And the third channels is vertical channels, which is supply chain effects. productivity gains in this channel achieved in the delivery of digital goods and services pass down the supply chain from primary producers to the end users. So the study with this approach estimates that total digital economy worth around 11.5 trillion US dollar, and it is around 15.5% of the global GDP. And about 18% is GDP of developed economies, and 10% is the GDP of developing economies. So we could see there is inequality or disparity between the DE, the digital economy, in developed as well, in contrast to in developing economies. The digital economy grown 2.5 times faster than the global GDP over the previous 15 years. And then in the US, there's also a study by BEA, which found that a digital economy accounted around 7% current GDP, and 10 years before, it was around 6%. Real value added in the digital economy grew with annual growth rate of almost 10%, which much higher compared to the overall economy or the overall GDP, which is only about 2.3%. This indicates that digital economy consistently contributed more to economic growth rather than to the share of the economy. In other words, it has a growth effect. Digital economy also supports about 5.1 million jobs, or 3.3% of the total employment. Next. I already mentioned that there's high concentration of digital economies in two countries, in the US and China. If you see in this slide, it depends on narrow definitions which calculate direct economic value of the digital economy, or indirect, includes the indirect. So it is between 4.5 to 15.5% of GDP globally. In the US, it's about between 6.9% to 21.8%, and in China, around 6 to 30%. So in terms of market capitalization, these two countries combined together, it's about 7 trillion US dollar in 2017, and then 2 years before it was 4.7 trillion US dollar. Internet search market globally, it's by Google, it's about 90%, and if we are talking about the mobile payment solutions in China, it's 100% is by WeChat and also Alipay. So there is a monopolistic trend over there. So the effect of digital economy or digital transformation, if you like, first one is, of course, the GDP, as mentioned before. Second one is sectoral value added. The graph is left bottom. We can see that there are geographically, it's you can see it's China, United States, very dominant over there. And then in terms of exports, it's also share of digital deliverable services increase with compound annual growth of around 7%. And then in terms of employment, there is some issues with regard to employment, which I will turn later in the later slides. And then the fifth one, as already explained, is financial market. Next. There are adverse effects of digital transformations. First of all, we could see that there are very high concentration, high market concentration in the two countries. Combined market value of the leading digital platforms companies was 7.2 trillion in 2017. Seven super platforms are Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Tencent, and Alibaba, accounted for around 2/3 of the total value, as mentioned before, suggesting very high concentration. And then also the total market capitalization of platforms valued above $1 billion accounted for 72%. Asia, mainly China, by 25%, EU by 3%. In terms of the number of platforms, US is 46%, Asia 35%, EU 18%, and the rest of the world is 1%. So the high concentration mainly in terms of value, not in the number of platforms companies. So tendency to develop higher market concentration, which is monopolistic trend, is due to network effects. The more users of a platform, the more valuable the platform becomes. And also due to the platform's ability to extract, control, and analyze data, they accumulate data from every interactions. And then the third one is dynamics of path dependency. So once a platform begins to gain traction, the cost of users of switching to alternative platforms are high. All of this ultimately leads to a growing economic inequality. Next. One of the application is in internet advertising. 2010, it's about 15% of all the advertising revenue. It is projected in 2023 to become 60%. And digital advertising spending more and more concentrated by now, which is in Google and Facebook. They account for about 65% of the total expenditures on digital advertising. This confirms what I mentioned about the tendency to have a monopolistic structure. Global digital platforms have risk of subordinate positions of developing countries. That's a consequence of that. While having to pay for the digital intelligence produced with those data. And then estimated growth of spending on digital advertising, the trend is consistently increasing. It's not very clear in the graph, but the graph number 2 from the right, you can see that Indonesia is in the 5th position with annual growth of around 20%. And then annual spending of lobbying by digital platforms, because they have a very big market and tendency to have concentration or structure of monopolistic. They have power also to bargain or to lobby to the global regulations. You can see that the tendency of expenditures on lobbying keep increasing by those 5 big companies. The dominance of global digital platforms and their capacity to create and capture the ensuing value are set to accentuate global inequalities. That's concluded by UNCTAD 2019. A fairer distributions of gains from the data and digital intelligence would need to break this vicious circle. Next. This is also showing the divides or disparities in terms of developing countries and developed countries, also between urban and rural, and also between male and female. So if we see population coverage by type of mobile network and in the mentioned area, there are apparent, quite apparent disparities between rural and urban in the developed as well as in developing countries. Developing countries being lagging behind. Also in the case of internet access as well as percentage of female and male population using the internet. The figure is in the left bottom. And then disparities, internet user gender parity. In terms of developed countries, the disparities are not there in the last figures, 2019. It was there year before, but in terms of developing countries, still have quite significant disparities. And also in terms of the cost of accessing the internet, proxied by percentage of spending on 1 gigabyte data towards the GDP per capita, you could see that in low-income country, the percentage is around 20%, while in the high-income country, the cost for buying 1 gigabyte data is only about 1% of the GDP per capita. So again, I can conclude that there is a high divide in terms of rural, urban, developing, as well as in terms of gender. Next. A problem is also with digital transformation. So far, also the human resource belong to the ICT. It is very we have a very large gap. Figures by ITU 2020 shows that very small for the, especially for the advanced skills. It's only about in 4 countries only that have advanced skills human resource, 15 to 50% of the total employment. But in developing countries or developing economies, they are mainly in basic, and even in basic skill, it is not the percentage. The percentage is not that big. So advanced and standard ICT skills workers, in other words, are insufficient in most of the economies. This insufficiency is often mentioned as the impediment to effective ICT use, particularly in developing countries. From the perspective of Schumpeter's creative destruction, the digital technologies may lead to some job destruction, of course, and some activities disappear, but also job creation as new activities emerge. In the short term, job destruction will probably outweigh the creations, but in the long run, job creations linked to increase in productivity from digitalization may more than compensate for the job losses during the transition period. So we should see it dynamically, which is in the long run. And then employment impact of digitalization technologies may be clearer if we see it in terms of inequality, as just described by the figures in the previous slide. Greater inequality and labor market polarization. Digitalization affects routine tasks performed by both less skilled workers as well as middle skilled workers, leading to hollowing out of the middle class. So there's a polarization of workers with high wages, and the other end is workers with very low wages. The middle part is disappearing because of the gig works. Also, the increasing concentration of digital platforms may weaken the bargaining power of the workers. There could also be gender-related impacts. Women could be more affected because they tend to overrepresented in overrepresented in conducting routine tasks that are at high risk of automation by these digital technologies. Next. Inequality concentration are related to the following risks of demographic changes, especially in developing countries. The number of population increase very much faster than in the developed one, and then also technology gaps among countries and within also a country. In developed, the gap is not that wide, but in developing countries it's quite wide. And then the other three factors over there. And then if we just see the graph on the upper right, it is correlation between GDP per capita to technological readiness index. We could see a positive correlation over there, meaning countries with low technological readiness condition tend to be lower income countries, and the opposite. And this connect to the graph in the upper left. We could see in the graph that in low income countries, most of the workers are less skilled. I mean, it is the big chunk, the latter segment of the graphs over there, but moving to the right is the high income countries. So because of low technological readiness and then low skills of the workers, the structure of employment like that leading to lower per capita GDP. And then the
Professor,
the,
sorry.
Yep.
Prof, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, yeah. Next. This is the last part of presentation. So directing digital transformation to support inclusive and sustainable development. There is a study by Mattis and Krasker mentioning that if we could relate between digital transformation with structural change or structural transformation, that could be more positive in terms of development, economic development. So they do that by linking digital transformation and structural change by identifying the drivers of structural change. There are 4 drivers of structural change: technology, preferences, input-output linkages, or the structure of the economy, and then trade. And then economic impact of digitalizations could be categorized into the 4 drivers, meaning in each drivers there's economic impact that could be resulted from the digitalization. And then potential linkages or linking the 2 transformations, which is digital transformation with structural transformation, would harmonize the efforts in both policy measures. I mean, the digitalization as well as the structural change. So the conclusion is that making digitalization as a part of structural change that would give better impact on inclusiveness as well as sustainability, because among the impacts are the improvement in the structure towards more inclusive, and also by input-output linkages as well as technology, the direction towards achieving the sustainable development goals can also be more effectively reached. Next. Following recommendations by UNCTAD, governments implement public policies to guide innovation in new and emerging technology so as to support sustainable development while dealing with any negative effects and ensuring that there is no one left behind. And this by using broad range of instruments from regulatory measures, economic fiscal instruments, to education, as well as regional policies that support the innovations. There are eight items could be put in place in order to ensure the inclusiveness as well as sustainable development goals to be achieved. That is setting ethical frameworks, ethical in terms of environment, also ethical frameworks in terms of inclusiveness toward alleviating poverty as well as inequality, and then conducting technological foresight and assessment to ensure also that the benefits could be gained properly, and then supporting inclusive innovations, including the micro, small, medium enterprises innovations friendly, deploying at scale. The scale is very important. Improving public services, bridging digital divides, yeah, and then investing in science, technology, and innovation skills, STI skills, and supporting active social citizens. Many efforts are being made by these non-government organizations that also need to be supported. And then last slide. Governments should attempt to maximize the potential benefits of digital transformation while mitigating harmful outcomes so as to achieve inclusive and sustainable goals. Policy should direct technological change towards reducing inequalities. For example, supporting micro, small, medium enterprises and rural businesses, and meeting the environmental and societal needs. And developing countries should adopt frontier digital technologies while continuing to diversify their production basis by mastering existing technology. And last one is social protection systems should be strengthened in order to provide safety nets for workers who may lose their livelihood. Besides these national measures, we need also international cooperations, which especially for the following 5 items, which is building stronger national capacity in the STI, science, technology, and innovations, and then smooth technological transfers, including to the poor and farmers and so on. Increase women's participation, improve foresight and technological assessment, and promote inclusive debate. To close my lecture, let me conclude that digital transformation is necessary, but not sufficient for economic development. The sufficient condition is policies to ensure that inclusiveness as well as sustainability can be effectively achieved. Thank you very much, Pak Ridwan.
Thank you very much, Prof. Hermanto. It's a very resourceful presentation. Then we can continue to our next speaker. I would like to welcome Dr. Arif Ayandi. Good morning, Pak Arif. How is Manila?
Good morning, Pak Ridwan. Manila is
yes, thank you, Pak Arif. Okay, the screen is yours. Time is around 30 minutes.
all right. Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank the Bank Indonesia Institute for hosting this event. I'm very grateful to be able to share my view here. Very good morning to Professor Hermanto Sirgar, Pak Ridwan, and all the distinguished ladies and gentlemen within the session here. Before I begin, let me just start with a usual disclaimer that all the views I express in this presentation are mine solely and do not necessarily represent those of the Asian Development Bank. So in the presentation, I will go into 4 main issues. First is I will bring you to update ourselves on the most recent situation of the COVID-19 around the globe as well as in the region. I will also talk about how economic recovery is underway, and which basically and naturally leads into a discussion of, among others, digital economics development. Then I will go a little more to see how digital economy is being measured, how much is present in the region as well as in Indonesia in particular, and then discuss with the several issues that needs to be tackled along the way. Let me begin my presentation with my first slide. So the COVID-19 situation currently is not looking really good. As you see there are in the left-hand side chart, you basically see that there are a lot of different humps occurring in the different lines there. Let me just guide you to the lines one by one. The one that I would like to draw your attention to is the red line. That's for Indonesia. But before we talk about Indonesia, let's just see what's going on with the world, which is just that dashed black line there. The world has already going through several different humps. The last one is the one that is caused by our region. The previous one is the one that is caused by India, mainly, and the one before is caused by the COVID-19 situation elsewhere, outside Asia, Europe in particular. Now, India has already gone through another wave of huge COVID-19 infection by the end of the first quarter 2021, and then which fortunately lasted not too long. So it went to the peak around mid-May of 2021, although the peak is really high actually, and then it went down since then. So India's economy is now set to go for another good run of recovery. Just recently, the last quarter growth rate for India came out at 20%, which is pretty nice, but not good enough. And then the blue line there represents our region, Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia are currently still looking at an increasing new daily cases of COVID-19 infections. Part of vaccination progress. The vaccination progress across the region varies quite dramatically. We are looking at a very low vaccination progress in countries like Myanmar and Afghanistan, including the Philippines. And we are looking at a very high vaccination progress in countries like Singapore and China. In Europe, US and Japan, the advanced industrialized economies, vaccination has progressed pretty well. All countries has now gotten into vaccinating more than 50% of their population, and that has a good benefit, which I'll show you in the next slide. The right-hand side diagram of this slide basically show how higher vaccination rates tends to be associated with much fewer fatality per COVID-19 cases, and also less hospitalization. The hospitalization rate is not shown here because the data is only available for a few countries, but that's at least what we observe from the data currently, right? And that situation basically gives you or gives an economy a leeway to keep on operating and maintaining their economic activity without having to go through such stringent measures like lockdowns and alike. And that basically gives economies like the Eurozone, the Euro area, Japan and the US, some leeway to keep their economy operating despite the fact that new daily COVID-19 cases there are also increasing. So the bottom line here is that although it's not the ultimate solution, the only solution, vaccination is actually one of the important things that we need to push in order for us to be able to maintain the momentum for recovery at a high rate. The left-hand side table gave you some development in Purchasing Managers Index, one of the leading indicators for manufacturing economic activity, at least through manufacturing perspectives. So as we see there, once we get to the second quarter of 2020, in the first quarter of 2021, most of the Asian economies, including Indonesia, has gone through a good run on a perception about activities in the manufacturing industries, right? The green light, the green color there gives you an indication that the PMI index goes above 50, which basically indicating a tendency of expanding activity in manufacturing sector, and that goes across the board in the region. But once we get into second quarter, first 2 months are still okay. PMI index are still high, but getting to the last month of the second quarter and entering the third quarter, we see a lot of reds. The red colors there indicates that the PMI index has already dipped below 50, which basically indicating some deteriorating situation or some slowing activity in the sector. And that's not a good news for the recovery progress, Indonesia included. Next slide, please. Now, with that, we see uneven progress of vaccinations. Our country is actually contributing to the divergence of growth paths in developing Asia. The color codes underneath, green to white, basically gives you some notion on how intense, on the intensity of vaccination that has been going on in different economies. And then on the top, you see the growth rate comparison between the first quarter of 2020 and the first half of 2020 and the first half of 2021. Taipei China needs special mention there because despite the fact that vaccination rate in the economy is not as progressing as rapidly as elsewhere, but the number of cases there is also very low. So that gives Taipei China some leeway to maintain its day-to-day economic activity without having to go through lockdowns or other mobility stringent measures. Indonesia is somewhere in between. Vaccination rate is progressing quite well. As of 2nd of September, we have already gotten about 23% of our population vaccinated. Not good enough, but at least it's progressing pretty well. Hopefully, it can progress much faster from now onwards. Unfortunately, when we look at the diagram, the first half of this year in many of other economies, except for a few countries, they are looking at very high growth. And in China, for example, the growth rates in the first half of 2021 is basically supported by high consumption. Similar situations also seen in countries like Malaysia, Hong Kong, and economies like Hong Kong and India. Indonesia consumption, unfortunately, is not yet coming back up as much as what we wanted it to be. Investment also not doing that well. And it leads Indonesia to get into just 3.1% growth rate within the first half of this year. Now, given this and the diagram, the table we show in the last slide about how PMI is developed in Q3, we have some warnings to do, and that also needs that also should draw attention from policymakers that there are things that we need to do in order to expedite and to maintain and pull back the momentum for growth recovery in our economy. Next slide, please. The good news is inflation. Inflation is relatively muted. It doesn't go anywhere closing to some alarming situation, despite the fact that global commodity prices are increasing. We see that global economic prices are increasing on the right-hand side chart, whereby the blue line represents, I think the blue line represents oil prices, and the red line represents food prices. Both are increasing since third quarter of last year, and it's still going up by this year onward so far. And that has nothing to do to affect the left-hand side chart, whereby you see inflation, including in Indonesia, are relatively flat at a very low level. Next slide, please. Now, the positive momentum from the global economy gave a good or a positive implication to our region, particularly to the export-oriented economies in our in Asia. If you look at the left-hand side diagram, we see the red line there. The main one is China. China exports has already jumping above the beginning of 2019, a situation before the pandemic, since June and July 2020. What has been the backbone of this rebound in exports in China? Mostly medical equipments and electronics. But by end of 2020, Asia is catching up. The orange line there. Asia is catching up, and then the world slowly catching up around December last year. And now, starting from January 2021, we have already seen exports growing above what we've seen before the pandemic. So there is some healthy situation in the global export demands nowadays. And another good news is that the goods that are being traded in the global market nowadays has already expanded beyond just medical kits and electronics. We see electronics, mechanical machinery, vehicles, exports now have already surpassed the pandemic-related goods as the main engine behind developing Asia exports in the right-hand chart diagram. Next, with that situation, we see Asia, Southeast Asia included, and Indonesia, of course, recovering by starting to grow positively this year, and hopefully going to continue next year. Based on our latest forecast on last July, we see Indonesia growth rate will recover to 4.1% this year, and then improve further to 5% next year. This is somewhat less than what is assumed in the budget for 2022 budget recently announced, but it's not that far. Even if Indonesia is growing by 5.5%, the maximum assumption in the budget, its economic activity will still undergoing a relatively slow recovery. So the question there in the slide, are we recovering? Yes, to some extent. But if you go to the next slide, you see that we are not quite yet recovering. Next slide, please. So we see in the left-hand side diagram, Southeast Asia situation. The dashed line there are the trend of GDP levels had there been no COVID-19 incidents back in 2020. So ASEAN economies should be staying somewhere around 110% plus in terms of index with 2019 equals 100, right, by the end of 2020. But with the rate of expected growth rates forecasted in the recovery we see in the last slide, the ASEAN economies will basically stay below where it's supposed to be had there been no COVID-19 by about, I think this is about 6-7% below the no pandemic situation. And that's not really a recovery in the sense. And only around end of 2021, ASEAN economies will start getting back to the level of GDP where it was before the pandemic, showing by the red horizontal line there. In the right-hand side diagram, we see the Indonesian case. The dip in Indonesian economy back in 2020 was not as severe as some other economies in the region. So basically, by now, we are already around the level of GDP before the pandemic. But that level of GDP pre-pandemic is still far below where we were supposed to be had there been no pandemic. And then by the end of 2020, with the rate of growth of 4.1% this year and 5%, or even 5.5% next year, we will still be far below the GDP level that was that we were supposed to get if we don't have to go through this pandemic situation. So in that case, I would argue that the economy will not be recovering as what it's supposed to be just yet, because we don't see those so-called V-shaped kind of recovery. And the charts here, the two charts here, basically suggest to you that the recovery is going to be kind of L-shaped. And if you were lucky, it's going to be look like a Nike sign or a swoosh shape at best. By the end of 2020, expected now, Indonesian GDP level will still fall short by about 6% below its pre-pandemic GDP level. Next slide, please. Because of the uncertainty in the situation, we at ADB are maintaining high-frequency monitoring economic activity, and this includes Indonesia. By doing this, we basically let me just step back a bit and explain to you what we do with this high frequency monitoring. So this high frequency the high frequency monitoring we maintain right now consist of two different models, and these two different models simply arise due to the pandemic. The first model is what I called as traditional indicators. We include 11 indicators that are representing consumption sector, investment sector consumption and investment sector from domestic activity, trade sectors, macroeconomic policy, and some indicators that represents external sector. And then because of the pandemic, the model broke down. As you can see, there are yellow dots in the diagram on the left-hand side chart. Those yellow dots basically comes from the consensus forecast. In the second quarter of 2020, consensus forecast gave up doing this monitoring because the model basically broke down and failed to capture the downturn in the second quarter and first and second quarter of last year due to the pandemic. We were also tempted to do the same because basically our traditional indicators fails to capture these things. But then again, we said we still need to think or to monitor what is happening within the economy. So we extend our model. We include 5 more indicators that basically representing activities in the tourism sectors as well as some confidence indicators, and that is represented on the right on the diagram by a green type triangles. So, and by the third quarter of the year, the green triangles have started to be able to pick up the pulse of economic activity in Indonesia. As you can see, the green triangle is coming much closer to where GDP growth were back in Q3 2020 relative to the red squares, which basically shows you the prediction based on our 11 indicators, traditional indicators. In the fourth quarter, both green triangles and red squares are converging. Red squares have better accuracy in predicting GDP growth rate in the fourth quarter of 2020 than the green triangles. And then for the first quarter of 2021, the red triangles again outperform the green triangles in terms of predicting or nowcasting the GDP growth level for the first quarter. In the second quarter, the red triangle largely undershoot the green triangle in tracking actual GDP growth rate for the second quarter. What can we say or what can we learn about this? Things that we can say out of this observation, basically two things. The first quarter of 2021 growth rates in Indonesia are basically being driven by so-called traditional indicators that are representing consumption, investment, trade, macroeconomic policy, and external sector. But in the second quarter, those traditional indicators somewhat failed to capture the pulse of the economy because the growth rate, the high 7.1% growth rate in the second quarter, are basically being driven mainly by tourism-related activities as well as some trade sectors activities. And this observation basically is confirmed by the data. Next slide, please. If we dissect the growth rates of Q2 2021 in Indonesia, we see that the majority of growth comes from three sources: wholesale and retail trade, manufacturing sectors, and then transport and accommodation. Right? Two things that I will combine: transport and accommodation are contributing about 1.3 percentage point to the total 7.1% growth rate in Q2 2021. Manufacturing sector contributing 1.35 percentage point, and the trade sector, wholesale and retail trade sector, are contributing 1.2% for the whole 7.7%. Why do we care, or why do I care talking about this disaggregation? This is because of one thing. That 1.35% contribution from the manufacturing sector is coming from a sector that are contributing 20%, that are occupying about 20% share of the total GDP. Trade sector is contributing 1.2 percentage point, which is about almost 18% of the total growth rates in Q2 2021. That sector accounts for about 13% of our GDP. But transport and accommodation combined, which gives about 20% of the total 7.1% in Q2, are coming from sectors that account only about 6% of the total GDP. So this 6% sector are contributing 20% of the total growth in 2021 Q2. And that's basically what it is. The other thing that needs to be noted is the right-hand side diagram. Despite the fact that we are growing at 7.1% in Q2 2021, we are still now about 6.5%, approximately 6.5% below the trend of where we should be had there been no pandemic. So we are still way to go to recover and catch up to our pre-pandemic level of activity. And next slide, please. As discussed just now, the pandemic has basically promoted digital activity. How and why? The right-hand side diagram gives you the mobility index outside residential areas for Indonesia in aggregate. So right after the pandemic hits March Mobility outside residential areas in Indonesia dropped significantly relative to where it used to be before the pandemic hits. And it has never come back into its pre-pandemic level, except for a brief period in around May and June 2021. And what does this imply? This implies that people are starting to go using digital platform in order to facilitate their transactions. You hear terms like the Gojek Aja or the Grab Aja more often in day-to-day conversations after the pandemic hits back in March 2020. And this is confirmed by the activity in the financial sector on the right-hand side diagram as well. If we look at most countries there, the use of hard cash has already been dropped significantly in between 2019 and 2020. Indonesia included. In Indonesia, the use of cash has dropped in 2020 by about more than 20% relative to the level they were in 2019. And then the use of e-wallet, credit cards, and point-of-sale finance or buy now kind of facilities have been increasing since then. Next slide, please. Now that we've established how digital economy has been taking a role in the recovery process of different economies, including Indonesia, I now want to take you to look at the actual size of the digital economies in different countries. When we look at the digital economies, we need to define what it is. And these digital economies here are defined as market value of production, which involve supply and use of core digital products. These are numbers estimated out of input-output information by our colleagues in ADB. And it represents the last observable points that is available for different economies. So for Indonesia, our colleagues can only get data for 2010 and 2014, and hence the measure here is about 7 years lagged. Indonesia there, in 2014, the size of digital economy is only less than 5%. And that digital economy is, then the digital sector is basically predominantly occupied by telco and hardware. So it's not so much on specialized support services, software publishing, and web publishing, different with some other economies. Now, if you said that, okay, it looks low and the distribution doesn't look really good or really even, because the data is lagging, we can see the US, one of the economy that, according to Pak Hermanto presentation as well, is the main player for this digital economy. The actual size of the digital subsector there in the US is also only less than 10% of its total GDP. And this is 2019 data, pre-pandemic data. After pandemic, I'm pretty sure it's going to be somewhat higher, but I'm not predicting that it's going to be double or near to it. So that's one point. However, in the next slide, please. There are also sectors that now in particular be disrupted or be affected significantly by digitalization. And these sectors include transport sector, one of the main driver of our growth rate in Q2, accommodation sector, the other main driver of our Q2 growth rate, and then food and beverage sector, which was included in the accommodation and food and beverage services. These are activities that are highly penetrated by digitalizations. And then we also see financial insurance services, which is also already very well penetrated by digitalization. Now, luckily, because our colleagues here at ADB are measuring this thing using an input-output table, they can then separate out the digitalization contribution to these different sectors and recompute the size of the digitalization in the economy in the next slide, please. So when we include the broader measure, the share of digital economy increased to about 17% to 35% of GDP, depending on the economy. We see it's really high in economies like Thailand, and that's for Thailand is only using data for 2015. So it's the difference between 2010, the red dot, and 2015, the blue dot. And within 5 years, the size of digitalization in Thai economy has jumped up from 25% of total GDP to about almost 30%. In Indonesia, in between 2010 and 2014, the jump is there, but not that high. So in 2010, it was somewhere less than 20%, about 19% something. In 2014, it goes up a bit to about 19%. And this is measuring the rate of digitalization within the economy from overall GDP based on the broader measure we have. US, which has the last data, now back in 2019, the rate of the share of digitalization in the economy is about 25%. So it's getting larger once we get into computing the indirect digital sector role in other sectors of the economy. Next slide, please.
Dr. Arif, I would like to remind you, you have 5 minutes left. 5 minutes left. Yeah, thank you.
So in this next slide, we basically see that there is an unequal access of the digital sector in different economies. For Indonesia, we are on the green. Back in 2019, the internet users per 100 people is only about 47%. So basically, out of 100 people, or basically we have about 53%, 53 to 54% of people that cannot or that doesn't have access to the internet. And when we talk about the digital platform, access to the internet is key. And if we are going to stay put with the situation in 2019, then basically we will only have about 47% of our population can cope up with the digitalization progress that is moving. That's one thing. The other thing is, out of this 47% of population that has access to the internet, I believe that not all of them are really having a good understanding of how internet and digitalization works. Most of these 47% users are probably just a user who knows how to connect, point and click, and that's it. And these people, this group of users are basically vulnerable towards digital crime. And that's something else that we need to watch when we are going to move forward with digitalization. Next slide, please. Now, with that note, I'd like to note that promoting digital economy really needs to take inclusiveness aspects into consideration. Why? Because the pandemic has pushed millions of Asians into poverty relative to the baseline scenario if there is no pandemic. In the diagram, you see that the number of people with income less than $3.2 a day has been increasing. And the increase of these poverty, this poor, is coming from people who, before the pandemic, has income above 3.2%, above 5%, above $3.2 per day, above $5 per day. Even those with income above $15 a day now has moved into income level below $3.2 a day. So this is something that is going to be this is something that we need to watch for, because next slide, please. Because the poorer households are the ones that are more likely experiencing job loss. The poor will be most vulnerable and being left behind when recovery is picking up solely on digitalization. So if we are going to rest our recovery on digitalization, these poor people who might not even have access to the internet are going to be left behind. And hence our recovery will have some sort of K-shaped recovery, whereby only a certain group of people going to enjoy welfare improvement, while the rest of them might have to go to a more miserable situation. Next slide, please. Let me close my observations here by saying a few things. There are other potential issues that requires actions if we were going to push forwards with accelerating digitalization in our economy. First is about data breaches and things similar to it that constitute cyber crimes. We need solid data protection mechanism in place, and the government as a regulator needs to really invest on this. The other things is about regulatory guidelines to protect users' rights. We heard a lot issues about how fintech has been an issue in Indonesia lately. There are a lot of cases now where people borrow from some unknown financial lenders online and then getting into troubles afterwards. Right? This kind of things needs to be watched and needs to be regulated very, very closely. The other thing is also some small things. We still have the law that stipulates rupiah as the legal tender for transaction in Indonesia. But if we go to a toll road in Indonesia nowadays, we cannot pay by rupiah. If we handed cash to the officers there, they will say no. We have to pay by e-toll or something, some cards. So these are regulations that needs to be adjusted if that thing is going to happen, because rejecting rupiah as a legal tender for payments is against the law. And then inclusive actions to ensure widespread benefit of digital transformation. We need to make sure that those who are potentially going to be left behind included into this development. Attention on productivity and competitiveness remains top priority. We cannot let some digital companies to monopolize and gaining larger and larger market share in their industry, which at the end of the day might stop competition from coming in to the whole industry. And the last thing is that we need to ensure that digitalization actually go hand in hand with promoting productive domestic production sector. So at the end of the day, we cannot just marketing import products through the online shops we have in Indonesia. We also need to market our own products. Last slide, please. So in conclusion, the pandemic is not yet over. Recovery is conditional. Vaccines, health infrastructure preparedness remain the key. The current recovery projection will take us long to actually catch up to where we are before the crisis. Still shaky. We don't know what's going to happen with the development of virus variants and stuff. The pandemic has promoted the rise of digital economy, highly beneficial, no doubt about it, but there are things that needs to be done and in order for us to cope with it appropriately. And the last thing I would like to say is that investing in productivity while ensuring social welfare improvements should remain the top priority of our policymakers in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Arif. I can call you Professor Arif. Once I know Pak Arif is also formerly lecturer from Pajajaran University. And participants, ladies and gentlemen, we should be very thankful for for these two international lecturers. Then we can continue to the Q&A session. I also invite all participants to have questions right in the chat box. And now I just got some questions. I can read it. The first one is from Pak Zikri from Department of Statistics. Dear Professor Hermanto, in digital economy, there is a big risk that big tech will occupy most data due to big data capabilities, whereas the government or authorities will leave behind. Therefore, I think it's very important to give the government and related authorities the power to acquire the data from the big tech. What is your opinion, Professor? Thank you very much. I think you can answer this question first, Professor Hermanto.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Ridwan, Pak Rizuki. There is also a lot of literature on governance, including how to manage the data, sharing the data, and so on. To some extent, perhaps what Pak Zikri proposed, yeah, that the authority should be allowed to have the data shared to the authority. But I mean, if we do through the certain technology like blockchain, actually that kind of the data as recorded in the technology can easily be owned or checked or monitored and so on. But if it is not using that kind of technology, as mentioned, for the sake of security of the internet users and so on, there should be power of the government to regulate the one that Pak Zikri mentioned.
Okay, I can also read another questions. It's pretty much the same. Maybe Pak Hermanto or Prof. Hermanto or Prof. Arif can answer the question. Is from Pak Sudiro from Bank Indonesia. How can emerging economies and less developed economies take advantage from the momentum of digitalizations in the midst of their limited access to digital technology? How is possible to create more equitable world in light of this digitalization? Prof. Hermanto or Dr. Arif can answer the question.
Maybe I'm not that clear what is being asked, Pak Ridwan.
Basically, they asked about maybe this question is related to your presentation. Is you mentioning about digital divide, Prof? There is a unequal distributions between, let's say, between Indonesia, less developed regions and developed regions. It's pretty much similar to with other questioning about how to spur digitalization in eastern part of Indonesia, like Papua.
Yeah. For the one within Indonesia, Indonesia bagian barat or Indonesia bagian timur, western part and eastern part of Indonesia, the government need to invest significantly, I think, because but we also mentioned about the importance of inclusiveness in the future of the economy with digitalization, it is very hard to realize unless we start investing, the infrastructure for the digitalization. But with regard to disparity between less developed countries and developed ones, international cooperation should, facilitate the need of the less developed country or developing countries. In fact, there are some efforts to support the less developed economies. If it is from the government of US, for instance, they have USAID, with possible support for specific kind of needs. And in my presentation also with regard to international cooperation, I put 4 to 5 items that could be implemented, But most of important thing I think is it's not less important than the infrastructure. Is actually, as Pak Arif also mentioned, is the human resource. We need at least standardized standard skill human resource in order to operate as well as to develop online business.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Hermanto. I can also spot another question here. It's basically the same. Maybe I can, there is also one question here, especially to Pak Arif, Dr. Arif Ayandi. In your last part presentation, you're mentioning about the current recovery projection will take us long to catch up. Still shaky. This seems maybe you can elaborate about this part. Seems like you are quite, the tone is a bit pessimistic about this, the recovery process, especially in light of time dimension.
All right. Thanks very much, Pak Ridwan. So on that remark, it's just that it may sound a little pessimistic, but actually I just want to put some note of cautions that we cannot just rest and say that, okay, COVID-19 cases in Indonesia has gone down, so we are going to go up for another fast growth in third and fourth quarter of the year. It's not automatic. Two things that we need to consider at least there. The first thing is the fact that our PMI index has dipped below 50 since the first month of the third quarter, July, August in particular. And that's going to say something about the momentum of economic activity that we are going. Some people might argue that this might caused by the mobility restrictions that was implemented recently. But that's not the whole of it. Once you see factories being closed down, then it will require some initial investment again to restart them. And that's going to take some time. That's not going to be easy. The other thing is about the evolution of this coronavirus types as well. There is no guarantee that we will not see another type of Delta virus that could actually have a country health sector and preparedness in the near future. So we have to be very vigilant about this, and we should not let down our guard at all, especially in trying to handle and controlling the spread of the virus, in particular in terms of avoiding fatality and hard implications of the virus infection, because only with that we can ensure our economy to keep on operating in at least a normal page. The other remark that I'd like to say about why it's still a long way for us to catch up is because we need a growth rate that much faster than 5% year on year in order to be able to catch up with the trend we had prior to the pandemic. And that's something that needs a lot of work. If I may go a little bit more on the previous questions that Pak Hermanto has handled earlier, there are also some questions about whether or not the digitalization economy can help to support high economic growth post-pandemic. It will be able to do so, especially because the digital economies, one of the main features of digital economies is cutting down the supply chain. So it's cutting down red tapes and stuff like that. So in that particular point of view, it's going to expedite growth by removing frictions within the economy. This is similar to free trade versus versus no free trade arguments in international trade theory, right? So once you have a free trade, you remove the frictions like tariffs and stuff, you will have better trade deal, and then you will have to see your economy growing better Hexer-Ohlins kind of, those kind of arguments are basically arguing for this kind of things. And that also applicable for this digitalization of the economy. But again, as Pak Hermanto rightly pointed out, it needs to be supported by right infrastructure, right human resources to back it up. And unfortunately, that's where more of the work needs to be done. Also related to what Zikri is saying, digital sectors are relying mostly on data, and hence having this data issue sorted out with the government is going to be a tricky thing to have, because they cannot just hand over their data to the government and make it become public, because it will kill their business. So this is a good. I don't think this is something that has already been sorted out completely, even in the international world. I stop there, Pak Ridwan. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Arif. Prof. Hermanto, you have something to say again, or?
Yes, I have read the chat box. With respect to Pak Sudiro questions, actually he asked about green economy and more equitable development in the future. Yeah, digitalization is can be used as measures, to reach the goals of sustainable development or green development, as well as the inclusive development. I mean, because in Indonesia, obviously, there are still wide room for us to do a lot of things with regard to digitalization. So the policies should be there in order to make some affirmation on the achievement of the SDGs, as well as more inclusive or equitable growth. Also, I mean, not only from a technical side, also from fiscal or government side, yeah, fiscal policy that in terms of tax reduction and so on could be formulated appropriately for such kind of efforts. And then there's also one question from Ibu Aulia Fitria. How would it possibly, whether it is possible for Islamic economic development to expedite the economic recovery, something like that. I think this is also the same thing. Currently, the government Komite Nasional Keuangan Syariah is actually enlarged not only for the keuangan or finance, but Komite Ekonomi dan Keuangan Syariah. So with that affirmation from the government and also from the big potential of farming economy in Indonesia, name it like fashion, food, cosmetics, tourism, and so on and so forth. Also, with the development of Bank Syariah Indonesia, the merger of the three Bank Syariah owned by the government, I think this could also be one way of strengthening the effort to achieve the economic recovery in Indonesia. Only thing is, so far as I know, and we still need a lot to give a socialization about what is Islamic economy, what is Islamic banking, start from school students, junior high school, senior high school, and so on, because literacy on Islamic economics, Islamic finance, Islamic banking, I think still quite low. I think those questions in the chat box, Pak Denny only said that what COVID has done is to bring tomorrow to today. Yeah, I agree about that. I mean, by the incident of the COVID pandemic, a lot of impediments to our development efforts could be clearly seen. And because more or less a lot of countries started from almost the same start line again, we should use the momentum to do the structural reform, digitalization, digital transformation, and so on, and do it appropriately with a very good governance. Arif has mentioned that red tapes and so on, which makes our economy inefficient, that also should be abolished, I think.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Hermanto. Ladies and gentlemen, now the time comes to an end for this lecture session. I'm really sorry for those of you who already sent questions, but we cannot handle it due to time constraints. And before closings, please allow me to read some key takeaways from this morning lecture. First, despite advantages of digitalization leads to recovery, potentially there is still divergence, global growth between, especially between developed and developing countries or regions, yeah, because of different capacities and capabilities. And vaccination and big stimulus, especially for rich countries, they have more advantages compared to developing or poor countries. As this also applies for regions within the national economy, like between the western part and eastern part of Indonesia. And from the perspective of internationalizations, accordingly, we see that the multilateral cooperation or integration is much more needed even before, for the case of vaccination especially, just like WHO, World Health Organization, said, in our interdependent world, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And the second one is this recovery. We hope it's not just only a recover. I mean, from the position in the pre-pandemic to after pandemic, but as mentioned from our both distinguished speakers, this recovery should also be used as a momentum to implement reforms in whole sectors, like structural reform, fiscal, monetary, and other parts of these reforms, in order to achieve higher growth and gain competitiveness in medium and long run. Once again, on behalf of Bank Indonesia Institute, we would very much thank you to our speakers, presenters here, Professor Hermanto and Dr. Arif. Maybe we can give some applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak.
And okay, thank you very much. And also, I'm very much thank you to all of you, wonderful participants, and hope to see you again in the next event of Bank Indonesia Institute. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Then I can listen.
Thank you, Dr. Ridwan, for the lecture session. Ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of lecture session. We would like to thank you all for your participation and hope we could see you again next year. After this, we will have BMEB Research Workshop at 10 a.m. Western Indonesia time. We would also like to remind all of you to fill in the attendance list. The link is given in the chat box. On the screen now, the QR code for you to scan and download the presentation material. Stay healthy and have a nice day. Good afternoon and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Terima kasih, Prof. Hermanto.
Terima kasih, Pak Ridwan, Pak Arif, Pak
Terima kasih,
Prof.
Semua.
Pak Ridwan.
Terima kasih, Pak Arif. Ya, terima kasih. Bapak Ibu semua di sini ada dari New York, Pak Putra, ada Pak Sudono, dan teman-teman. Terima kasih semua. Oh, dari Palembang juga ada Pak Hari. Salam wabarakatuh. Live ya, izin live ya.
Ya, mari Pak.
Ya, sehat-sehat selalu Bapak-bapak, Ibu semua.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih, Bu Emi.
Amin. Amin.